Welcome to an hour with the Tower. We are going to be joined by quite a few different celebrities in the poker industry, chatting basically about the life story. First up is the legend. He is the man that has been around the block for over 30 years. He's going to tell me a little bit different, to be even longer than that, I am sure. But welcome on board, Mr. Joe Beevers. How are we doing, Joe?
I'm doing pretty good, Phil. Thanks for having me here. It's a pleasure to be on an hour with the Tower. You know what? If we start talking and getting a couple of pints in, it might go on for a bit more than an hour.
We could sit in a pub and talk for days. Starting at the beginning, hopefully, we'll run through from start to finish with some interesting stories. I'm looking forward to this because I know there's a good few stories in there. Over $2.5 million in live earnings. Where did it all start? I
guess I started playing poker when I was at university. When I graduated from uni, I was 20. I went back as a mature student. I did finance. And I think I was like 23, something like that. The year after I graduated, I went to Vegas for the very first time, but not to play poker. I was just traveling around, taking some time out. But I had started playing poker whilst I was at university. And I was up in what was Sergeant York's casino, which is now, which was Grosvenor, which has now moved in Luton from the Dunstable Road to where it is now. And they used to have tournaments every evening, £10 rebuy tournaments. Like every Tuesday was a 7-card stud tournament. Every Thursday was the pot limit hold'em. Every Friday was the no limit hold'em. And I was actually up there playing blackjack with some friends. And I was playing with a couple of guys, and they got up to leave in the middle of a shoot. And I said, "Where are you going?" They said, "We're going to play a poker tournament." I said, "How does that work?" I mean, I played with friends, I played some brag and stuff.
Yeah.
They said, "Well, you pay a tenner to enter." So I said, "What? I can only lose a tenner." They said, "Well, you can re-enter if you want, but you can't lose more than £10 in one go." And I was winning £300 or £400 playing blackjack. So I thought, this sounds a bit of fun. So I went over and I paid my tenner, and it was 7-card stud. This is the first tournament I ever played. So I kind of, I thought I knew what I was doing. So they gave me 500 in chips, and I passed 3 or 4 hands, and then I found a pair of queens. And somebody raised and somebody else raised, and the bet was now 500. And you used to start with 500 chips in these tournaments, right?
Yeah.
And I only had 350 points left from the 4 or 5 hands I'd played. So I didn't know what to do. So I said, "Well, I've only got 350 points. What should I do?" And the guy sat beside me was a big bookmaker, Brian Stanovich. And he said, "Just put it in, John." So I put the 350 in, and all the cards got dealt out, and someone turned over aces and someone turned over kings, and my queens didn't improve, and I lost the pot. So now I didn't have any chips and I didn't know what to do. I said, "What do I do now?" The whole table shouted, "Rebuy!" So I got a tenner out, and Carmel Price handed me a £10. She handed me a 500-point chip. So I threw the chip to the guy that just won the pot and said, "I think I owe you 150.
Imagine a rebuy these days starting with 500 chips.
Imagine thinking you owe somebody after you lost the pot.
Oh, that's brilliant. But obviously, going to the tables when you first sit down and going to everybody knows you're a newbie. Nobody really knows Joe Beevers at the time. Even then, they'd still help you out, wouldn't they?
Yeah, I mean, when I started playing, the casinos weren't allowed to charge for poker tournaments.
Yeah.
They weren't allowed to rake pots. They had a 48-hour rule. Things were very, very different. And the majority of casinos ran poker tournaments for, to get people in the door. They used to say they'd run it as a loss leader. But staff is one of the most expensive costs for a casino. So all the games were self-deal. So you would shuffle on the left, cut behind, and then the person would deal, and then the deal would move around the table. And that's what would happen. And sometimes you'd have someone that said, I'm not very good at dealing, will you deal for me? But most people could deal. Yeah. I could handle a deck of cards even then, but I didn't know the processes. I didn't know how everything worked. But yeah, all the games were self-deal. If we were lucky, we would get a dealer for the final table.
Yeah. Is that when you met the guys that became the Hendon Mob, Ross,
Well,
Barney, and Ram?
yes, kind of. I mean, that first time in Luton, I didn't do very well. Okay, obviously, I didn't really know what I was doing, but I kind of liked it, and I became a regular up there. This would have been in the mid-90s, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
So I was playing up there 5-6 nights a week, and one of the things I noticed, people say to me, "How did I learn?" Because when I learned, there was no internet, there were no. I'm making us sound really old here, Phil, because I know you're the same age as me. There was no internet, there were no training guides, there were no coaches. I think there was one book. I think Mason Melmoth had a book and perhaps Doyle Brunson had a book, but that was it. So you learnt by playing. And I noticed that the same players made the money and made the final tables every week. So I started at 2 o'clock. They would have a breakfast, a cheap breakfast in the restaurant. I think it was like £3 for a full fryer. And whenever I saw one of the guys that had made the final table having breakfast, I went over and bought them breakfast. And I sat and chatted to them and asked them questions. And that's how I learned playing poker. That's where I met. Ram as well. No, I didn't meet Ram there. I mean, I got a funny story about how I met Ram, and I'll tell you that in a minute. But over time, Barney, Ross, and Ram and me, Luton became our regular. Our regular venue, and the Vic, obviously. Barney and Ross living in Archway near Hendon would play at the Vic all the time, but we'd all go to Luton, especially for the festivals. I remember Ram won back-to-back tournaments in one festival there, and yeah, that was our local, and then we started doing quite well.
Yeah, and then obviously you started to travel around a little bit, and then you've just been talking about the mid-90s. Can you remember your first ever entry into your Hendon Mob database?
Yes, I can. I like I said, the first time I went to Vegas. See my Las Vegas Raiders top?
I love it. Unbelievable. I can't believe you
go to one of their games in their first season this season. Shipped over especially from California. All our Las Vegas Raiders stuff. So I went to Vegas the first time ever in '94, but the first time I went to Vegas to play poker was in '96, and I was doing very well in the cash games. So I bought myself into a $3,000 pot limit hold'em tournament, first World Series of Poker event I ever played.
Yeah.
And we got down to 2 tables. It was all very, very different then. The tables, it was like 2 tables being in the middle of, just a normal card room. People milling around, people walking up to the table. Nothing was roped off. First prize was, I don't know, what was first prize in that tournament?
$180,000.
$180,000. Anyway, we're down to 2 tables, and I'm in the money. And I got into a pot with Jennifer Harmon, and she raised, and I moved all in with Ace Queen, and she called me with pocket. After a long, long dwell, she called me with pocket 10s, and the flop came 10-10-2, and that was the end of my first World Series. But I cashed in that tournament. I think I cashed $4,500, and it was won by Barbara Enright.
It was indeed.
Yeah, Barbara Enright. That was my first ever World Series of Poker tournament and my first ever proper big cash. Obviously I've had cashes at Luton before, but this was my first World Series cash.
Going back to Barbara winning, obviously we still talk about how there aren't as many women in poker as I would like. Your first event, when you finished 14th, was won by a woman. What was the percentage of women in Vegas at that time?
Do you know what? It was probably a similar kind of percentage than it is now. It's
really?
Probably
not increased?
Well, I don't. It's hard to say, Phil. I can remember Jennifer and Annie Duke playing in the big limit cash games at the Binions Horseshoe. I remember Barbara was there, and there were a handful. I would say there's more female players now. Thinking back, I would definitely say the percentage is bigger now. It's definitely opened up.
Yeah. Quick quiz question. How many entries were there in that tournament?
186.
Oh, it's close. It's close. It's 180. That's not a bad guess from what, 25, nearly 25. That's nearly 25 years ago, Joe.
It is nearly 25 years ago next year. Yeah, 25 years next year.
Yeah, 1996. And also on that final table, British lady, Lucy Rocash.
Ah, yeah.
Yes, finished third.
She was doing things that people at the time thought were incredibly unorthodox, and they used to say Lucy getting lucky again. But she was like the queen of the first. You know, she was always re-raising. I always remember it comes to she'd go, "We raise," and off she'd go with her ace-7 offsuit, and she'd win a big pot, and someone would say, "How can you re-raise with ace-7 offsuit?" But she always had mountains and mountains of chips, and she was a talent before her time.
Unbelievable! I tell you what, the stories that because I was speaking about the ladies, first, third, and Jenny Harman on that final table as well. You know, you don't get that nowadays. And that was 1996. So it just shows you the amount of women in that field. It looks like most of them made the final table.
Yeah, I mean, all those women players that we mentioned are all very, very good poker players.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Joe, we're just going to leave it there for part one, but we'll be back very, very shortly with part two.